Hey everybody, today is Monday, January 17th, 2022. Coming up on the show today, from Licorice Pizza, editor Andy Jurgensen.
When you stay with the take for so long, you kind of become aware of it, but then when you have the cut, it's got to be an important moment or a good moment. That is like a sacred time and space, is watching these dailies with a kind of a communal audience. Our final product, yes, most people are going to be seeing it in DCP, but to him, the final product is a 35 millimeter photochemically timed print made from cut negative.
Yes, all that and a lot more on this episode of The Rough Cut. All right, hello, my friends. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for staying. I do appreciate having you here with me on our Adventures in Post-Production Scholarship. Our visiting faculty member today is a super nice guy and talented editor named Andy Jurgensen. Andy has a new film in theaters called Licorice Pizza. What can I tell you about that film? Well, it's a Paul Thomas Anderson film. How about that? That ought to tell you a lot right there. Boogie Nights, Magnolia, Punch Drunk Love, There Will Be Blood, The Master, Phantom Thread. What does that all mean? Well, in the case of Licorice Pizza, I guess it means it's a film that explores interesting lead characters who intersect with even more interesting secondary characters. It's dialogue over big action set pieces. Although Licorice Pizza does have some cool stunt car driving. The film takes place in LA's San Fernando Valley in the early 70s and is a semi-biographical film, which means that it's based on some real people, some real interesting people. It tells the tale of Gary Valentine, played by Cooper Hoffman, who is a 15-year-old actor turned entrepreneur who becomes infatuated with 25-year-old Alana Kane, played by Alana Haim. Now, despite rejecting his romantic overtures due to their obvious age difference, Alana can't deny Gary's charisma and charm, oh, that's sweet, and realizes her life is more interesting with Gary in it. So she becomes partners with him in his burgeoning waterbed business. And then it goes on from there. Andy has a lot of great stuff to share with us about his time on the film and the unique processes Paul Anderson uses to make his films, especially the shooting on film part. I know what you're thinking, other directors still shoot on film, but from the sound of it, Anderson really embraces the process. I mean, if you didn't know anything about editing film before, you're going to find out a lot today. We got a lot to talk about with Andy, and you know we will, but first, a quick word or two from our sponsors. Now, you may or may not shoot on film yourself, probably not, but you probably do have lots of media that needs moving around amongst your geographically dispersed team. Lots of high-res media. Lots of bandwidth-hogging media that's a pain to move. Well, Massive and their cloud-based file transfer solution is here to help you do that and do it better than your current provider, if you have one. Massive is a cloud file transfer solution that makes it fast and easy to send massive files. Doesn't matter if you're sending 20 gigabytes, 200 gigabytes, or up to 5 terabytes of data. Massive consistently delivers files in record time thanks to a network of 150 global data centers and zero throttling on transfers. So sign up for Massive today and experience fast, reliable, and secure file transfer for both uploads and downloads. Best of all, if you use my link at massive.io/the-rough-cut, you get 100 gigabytes free towards your transfer. Once again, that's massive.io/the-rough-cut. Someone else you got to know if you are looking for the best in production audio. And honestly, who would be looking for the worst? Not me. But if it is the best music you want, well, Extreme Music are the ones you got to call. For over 20 years, they've been helping filmmakers, TV makers, all your basic content creators sound their best with music from top-shelf talent. Yes, some of the biggest names in film composing, producing, and music making. Names like Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross, Quincy Jones, Timbaland, Mark Mothersbaugh, and the list doth go on. They've brought all that great music together into an easy-to-use website where you can search by genre, tempo, lyrics, all kinds of keywords that will dial up just what you're looking for. And when you have found it, you can customize your tracks right down to the individual instruments. They can even help you license it right there online. Couldn't be easier. But if you are still a little stuck, they have reps all over the world that can advise you on the process. So the next time you're looking for great music for your great movie or TV show, do yourself a great big favor and check out extrememusic.com. Hey, speaking of music, do you get what the term Licorice Pizza refers to? It's a record. You know, a vinyl record. And if you're too young to know what a record is, I really don't have the time to explain that concept. Much better to spend this time listening to Andy tell us about his movie. So here is Licorice Pizza editor, Andy Jurgensen. Well, Andy, I got to warn you ahead of time, I got a little help from one of your associates in crafting this line of questioning, at least as it pertains to Licorice Pizza. So I'm going to pepper those in here and there. But before we get into the actual film, I was struck by some similarities to a recent interview I did with an editor named Cam McLaughlin, who cut Nightmare Alley for Guillermo del Toro. Similarities in terms of your histories with your respective directors, these current films being your first jobs as lead editors with said directors. So I thought it would be only fitting and kind of interesting, I hope, to ask you some of the same questions I asked Cam, but obviously crafted for you. So hopefully you can roll with that.
Sure. Actually, I listened to that interview a couple days ago, and it was very good.
Excellent. Well, then you should already know the answers. So Licorice Pizza is your first gig as lead editor for Paul Thomas Anderson. You did some associate editing on Phantom Thread with Dylan Tichenor, I believe, but your relationship with Paul does go back further than that. So tell me about first meeting Paul and the work you've done with him over the years.
Well, I started working with him in 2013 on Inherent Vice. I had been the assistant of Leslie Jones on a couple movies. And, she was the editor on Punch Drunk Love, and she worked on The Master. So she brought me on. So I just was like an assistant being brought on. And so that was my first experience with Paul. And it was quite a learning curve because I'll talk about it later, but we have this whole film element where we watch dailies on film, we cut work print, we cut negative, all sorts of things. So it was definitely a learning curve because I had never done that before. So after that, I survived. And then he asked me to cut a little music video for him for Joanna Newsom. And then I think after that, I worked on this documentary with him that he did with Johnny Greenwood called Janoon. And then we started doing more music videos with Haim and Radiohead. And then he asked me to work with Dylan on Phantom Thread. So he just kind of kept me around. And then it evolved to this. Him asking me to cut this movie.
That should be the next logical question then. What were the circumstances, aside from your rich experience together, that led to you getting the call to be the lead editor? What in Paul's mind made him say, the time is right, Andy's going to take the reins of my new film?
Well, Dylan was on Eternals, so that was one thing. He was on that for, I think, 2.5 years, or maybe even 3 years. So he wasn't even available. And, he really chooses people from his circle, his sort of inner circle, because we know him, we know what he likes, he trusts us. So it really wasn't even a, official meeting kind of thing. I think it was just in passing. He was like, "Oh, you want to cut the next movie?" I was like, "Sure." It kind of was as easy as that. And I had also been working on these camera tests. That's a big part of our process is we do tests. Some of those actually turn into these Haim videos, but we also were doing screen tests with Cooper and Alana, which I was working on, and we cut a couple scenes together for that. So I was kind of already working on the movie. And then when it came time to go, obviously COVID happened, so we had to be delayed a little bit, but it just happened.
The whole idea of you cutting work print and dealing with film, it's hard not to jump right ahead to that, but maybe this question is kind of along that line. And that is if there have been any significant changes or advancements to the process or workflow you've used with Anderson throughout the course of your working relationship.
Yes. Well, film dailies are always a big part of his process. I've talked about this in other interviews, but one thing that we do is so in addition to scanning, we shoot everything on film. That goes without saying. But in addition to scanning and doing digital dailies, we actually work print, and we have PhotoChem sync that up. And during the shoot, we have dailies. We have daily screenings with crew members. So it's either at the end of the day or beginning of the day, beginning of the shoot day. Sometimes on weekends or on our off days. If we get behind, we'll watch stuff, spend like a few hours. But that's a big part of his process. Is we watch it on a big screen and watch it big and judge performances and judge technical things and lighting. And sometimes we usually make a lot of our choices of what we're going to use in the movie from these daily screenings. And he'll also decide we're going to reshoot something because of what he's seen. And this is not something that most directors do. I know we all have picks. First of all, by the way, we don't have picks. We don't even do digital picks for anybody. We don't even have an account. So if you want to come see dailies, you come to the screenings, or if you need something, editorial will provide it to you. But that is like a sacred time and space, is watching these dailies with kind of a communal audience. We couldn't have as many people as we usually have because of COVID, but we did have the camera crew and production designer, and I would always be there. And sometimes Paul would play music just to get a sense of how, a shot's feeling. At the end of the shoot, I have a huge binder with all of my notes, and that's what we use to cut the movie.
So, it makes a lot of sense, at least to me anyway, the notion of the communal aspect of watching dailies and watching them big and being able to be a better judge of what you actually have to work with. But the film part of it, what is his reasoning? What is his argument for why it has to be filmed? You could certainly do that with digital.
Our final product, yes, most people are going to be seeing it in DCP, but to him, the final product is a 35 millimeter photochemically timed print made from cut negative. That's what he wants to finish his movie on. Sometimes we'll do a blow up to 70, which we did in this. Actually, we've done on all three movies that I've worked on. We did a blow up, a 70 millimeter blow up. And that's one of our elements. But he just likes to keep that old fashioned filmmaking process alive. I mean, there's only, I think, 3 directors that still cut negative, and it's Tarantino, and it's Chris Nolan, and it's Paul. That's it, that I know of.
Who am I to argue with any of them? And you will get no argument from me because I think that's awesome. Aside from that unique film component, how would you describe Paul's process overall and how it might be unique from other directors you've worked with?
One of the things is he's so in tune with everything. I mean, from the beginning, obviously he writes his own scripts, but he starts, when he's writing the scripts, he comes up with song ideas, and he's, kind of already figured out the songs even beforehand. We have a music supervisor, but not a music supervisor that like provides ideas. It's mostly like she works to license the songs, but he chooses all the songs. He has a lot of reference material of how the movie's going to look. Obviously, everything's a collaboration, but he's just so in tune to everything. And then when we're shooting the movie, he's one of the co-cinematographers on this. He knows lenses, he knows film stock, lighting, different kinds of light, quality of light from different things. And then even in the finishing, he's there in the DI room all the time. He knows how he wants the movie to look in the end. And then also with the photochemical finishing, how he wants that to look. He's a true auteur, I guess you could say, because his hands are on everything. And even marketing material. I mean, we will make these little teasers for, things on Instagram. There's a great team that works on the trailer, but we'll also take the trailer and we'll add stuff that we like and poster ideas. I mean, it's just, I don't know someone that is more hands-on.
Well, as you said, among the many hats that he wears on all his films, he wrote the script. When you read the script for Licorice Pizza, which has a somewhat provocative premise, what did you think, and what notes or questions did you have for Paul?
Well, the funny thing is that, most people going into the movie, they kind of have no idea where it's going to go. You have no idea that the truck sequence is going to happen when that happens, or the whole tail of the cock stuff. So it was just so fun to read it and kind of go on this ride. So that's one thing I took from it, was just this first reading of the script goes in all these crazy, wild directions. So we have to make sure that we preserve that feeling with the movie, with the editing of the movie, and with just how everything's kind of revealed, to just kind of go for it. And when I first read the script, Alana had already been cast, and they were trying to decide who they were going to cast for the Gary part. I do remember, this first screen test that we had with the two of them. They were a little rough around the edges, but something felt right with the combination of the two of them. And, you could say, if you're reading the script, obviously there's this whole age difference thing. With the wrong combination of actors, it might feel icky. That's maybe the wrong word, but you know what I mean? It might feel wrong, but the combination, this magnetism that the two of them had, it just worked. And it didn't feel like it was exploitative or inappropriate.
Having the experience that you do with Paul, and we'll get into this more and more, just talking about his style of filmmaking, his style of storytelling, which is just so character driven. And so this is not a Hitchcock movie with a big MacGuffin and a big plot machine in place. It's really about getting to know these very interesting people in very interesting circumstances. Do you feel comfortable asking him why? Like, there's a sequence in the film where the Gary character gets picked up for murder mistakenly and then is released. And it's 5-6 minutes of the movie, but that's it. That has nothing to do with the larger movie as a whole, other than another element in which we can bring these two characters together, Gary and Alana together. So when you get these very unique Paulisms that are happening through this movie, do you ever ask him, why'd you do that, Paul?
Well, I think you touched on the whole purpose of the movie. It really is about these two characters connecting and disconnecting and going back and forth. That's the real central core of the movie. And the plot is just kind of serving, this quote unquote plot is kind of just serving the purpose of them coming together and coming apart. Also, this is based on true stories, and that was something that really did happen. Another element of this movie is that it's a nostalgic piece. There was a reviewer that was talking about the movie and called it a cinematic scrapbook. And I thought that was a really perfect way to describe this movie. Just the way that it kind of transitions from sort of episode to episode, and it's almost like you're turning the page on memories, So that's kind of the vibe that we were going for.
So Paul says, "Hey, Andy, it's your turn. What are your action items? What are your next steps? What calls do you make? What things do you do? What do you have to have in place?"
Well, I would be nowhere without our post supervisor, Erica Frauman, who has been with Paul and since There Will Be Blood, and she's like the core of the editorial team, to be honest. I would be nothing without her. And then I had to find a really good first assistant because I had been on the previous 2 movies, and I now knew the whole process, but I had to find someone that could do it, that I could teach, how to make all these cut lists and be really on it, because you cannot make a mistake, when you're cutting negative. But we also, Paul talked to all of us about things that he wanted to emulate. American Graffiti was a really big movie that he showed all the kids in the movie, and kind of wanted to create that vibe, in the look and the soundscape. And obviously there's a lot of music in that. So kind of emulate that. And then all of these camera tests is a big part of the process to get the transfer right. But also to figure out the right look and the stock and stuff like that. He's asking all the time. He's like, what lens is this? What stock is this? So all of that stuff, what f-stop are we at? All of that stuff we have to make sure is in all of our notes. Obviously, it's in camera reports. We're sometimes pushing film to stops or, doing various things in the developing. We really have to get a handle on that. And then once shooting starts, I'm always kind of aware, like, okay, Paul likes this 100 millimeter lens or whatever. So I'm just kind of making notes, and sometimes he'll ask like, oh, what was that? What was that? So it's always kind of just keeping track of what scenes we're shooting on which stock. And it always is going to help future days of shooting. Another thing that we have to use so much is the dupe detection.
Oh, of course.
I mean, it's so important,
right?
And you have to have the dupe detection with the extra frame on it, because when you're cutting negative, you lose a frame when it gets spliced together.
And you have to make sure you have the 35 millimeter project type checked.
Yep, 100%.
I've always wanted to do one of these interviews sort of in real time, watching the movie with the editor, sort of like a DVD commentary. For logistical and copyright reasons, that I'm sure that'll never happen. But in lieu of that, I'd like to walk you through my somewhat random notes on the film and have you fill in the blanks. So who knows how this is going to go? And sometimes there's not actually a real question. It's just me espousing my worldview. But I thought we'd begin from the beginning. And that is that you don't waste any time getting to know the leads. They meet right away, and we don't really interact with any other major characters in the first 10 minutes. It's Gary and Alana all the time. And this plays out over some long shots, not quite a oneer, as has become so common to open a film these days, but some long choreographed shots all the same. So tell me about that open, which seemed a little tricky to make look so relaxed. And that style of filmmaking, how that might impact you as an editor. Do you get fewer choices in terms of takes when there's longer shots like that? How did that whole open take place?
That was tricky, actually. A lot of different angles of that whole walk and talk. Not the stuff that's in the gym when they're taking the pictures. The initial walk and talk. I mean, I think we shot that over 2 days because we were trying to get the look right, and we were changing the script a little bit. And it would just, we had to nail that first meeting. It's so important. But we settled that first take of Alana. So there's a couple quick takes at the beginning. I believe that the walk and talk is really 2 shots.
Well, there's a tracking shot that starts to follow Alana, then hits Gary, and then goes in the reverse.
Yeah, but then after that point, it's the shot of Alana saying "fuck off, teenagers" or whatever she says, and then Gary turns, and I think it goes for like a minute or something, a minute and a half, and then there's a cut to the other side, and that's it. We knew we really liked that take of Alana. And so we stay with that as long as possible because, you're just watching her face the whole time and you just get so much just from her reactions. But the struggle was, first of all, finding where the cut point was going to be, because when you stay with the take for so long, you kind of become aware of it. But then when you have the cut, it's got to be on an important moment or a good moment. So we had some shots that were from the front angle. And I remember we did do a version where we were cutting back and forth, but it just didn't feel right. It felt too cutty. And then we found this other take, which we had liked. But what was so cool about it was it starts off cutting to Gary, but then they kind of do a little dance and then she comes in frame for the end of it. So I know I did struggle with like frame fucking that little cut point for like a day, going back and forth, trying to get it perfect with like how they were walking and stuff, but we got it.
So again, that opening scene, you talked about music a little bit and we'll talk about it some more, but it ends in time with the needle drop. In this case, it's a Nina Simone song, July Tree. The scene ends right as the song ends and the song is playing throughout. What was your process for cutting that scene so that it all timed out right to the end of that song?
Well, we had to loop the song. So it's actually pretty short. So we had to loop a couple verses. And then the end, I think I stretched a little something so that it landed exactly right. But sometimes you just get lucky.
Truer words are never spoken when it comes to editing. Sometimes you just get lucky. Immediately following that opening scene is a very quick scene. Gary and his brother Greg are at a hot dog stand, and Gary says to his brother, I just met the girl I'm going to marry, Greg, and you're going to be my best man. It's only really 2 lines. I mean, I think the whole scene is 30 seconds. And then you're out and you're back to the 2 brothers walking home. So what could be considered a throwaway scene in any other film seems very important in the context of this film. Was that scene initially a lot longer? And was there any time that it was out of any of your cuts?
Yes, it actually wasn't much longer, but it was out at one point. And I think it was Sarah and I. Sarah was one of the producers. We fought and we were like, you know what? This should go back in. It's sweet. It really adds something. Paul, I think, knew ultimately, but we were, there was a time when you're just trying to like, oh, what could you get rid of? And that was a scene that you could get rid of. But I don't know. It was nice to kind of develop that little relationship with him and his brother.
It definitely helps align you with Gary and be in his corner and really like him before the movie's even really underway. As we've talked about, Paul wrote the script. Obviously, he has a very clear vision of what he wants. But because, as we've talked about and we'll keep talking about, it's really more of a character study. What guides your editing process, your storytelling process, when you're working in a film like this, it really doesn't have a true plot?
Well, again, it goes back to the characters, and it's going back to the characters' relationship, because since that's what's at the core of this movie, I mean, that's really dictating it. Also, sometimes this is a comedy too. So, sometimes there's jokes that you want to keep in, or there's things that just don't work or whatever. And to be honest, a good sequence to kind of talk about what you're saying is the whole tail of the cock sequence, because that was actually a lot longer. And there was a monologue. Tom Waits did this whole monologue about being a filmmaker being a filmmaker back in the day. And it just went on and on and on. Great stuff. But that sequence is really all about Sean Penn's character having this bizarre experience with Alana, and then Gary coming in and the 2 of them looking at each other and kind of getting jealous. And that's really all it is. And then just these antics and just like kind of drunken craziness. So Paul and I were talking about this sequence, and he was like, it's just got to be kind of a crazy drunken thing. And so we just kind of made it, like, started chopping it up, and, they're like fighting with forks. And so we knew what we had to do is we had to get through that sequence. So it was like paring down that sequence to get them outside for that whole motorcycle jump.
Well, one of the things I noticed in their first dinner scene with Gary and Alana, they sit down at the table and there's a crash from the kitchen off screen, and you see Gary look over his shoulder. We don't see this crash happen. It doesn't have any impact on the scene. You just happen to see Gary looking over his shoulder to see what the noise could be. That's it. Was that scripted, or was that just the take you wanted to use of Cooper? He happened to be looking over his shoulder and you said, I need to give him a reason to look over his shoulder.
Yeah, total accident that just happened on set. I think someone dropped plates or something, and we just really liked that take. And it kind of felt like a fun way to just get into the scene, just like someone in the background dropping a whole bunch of glasses. So we did augment the sound, but it's also, this is Gary's place. This is Gary's restaurant. It's his spot. And like the first date that he's taking this girl on, or date, quote unquote, someone's dropping plates in the background. So it just kind of added to the nervousness, I would say.
We started off early on talking about that Nina Simone needle drop that opens the film. Music, needle drop, score, certainly diegetic music is one of the more important tools at your disposal in setting the period of a film or the era of a film. In this case, the early 70s, I think it's 1973. I don't know if it ever gets that specific.
Yes, it is 1973. A little vague though, too. I mean, it is, but also, I mean, it's a little vague just even how much time passes.
Well, and using those tools, using that music, seems like a lot of fun. I think in the case of the July Tree, the Nina Simone song, you said Paul said, he picked that song. Does he actually give you a playlist? Do you get to do your own search and discovery? How do the needle drops work for Licorice Pizza?
Well, what he'll do is at the beginning, he'll give me a big bin of songs. He doesn't give me an actual bin. He gives me, a big playlist, and I put it in a bin. But that's what we always pick from. So actually in the script, there were songs already notated of what he wanted in certain spots. And then, as we're building the movie, he'll be like, oh, let's try this song. Or sometimes we'll switch it. But honestly, a lot of the songs that he wanted ended up being in the final movie. And they also had kind of figured out budget-wise in advance, like, obviously it's going to be expensive. So he kind of had already provided a bunch of tracks to see how much those would cost.
Well, I mean, budget always plays a part, but are there rules? If we're using needle drops to help establish a period, are there rules to that? I mean, it's 1973. The Nina Simone song, July Tree, came out in 65. So that's prior to 73. So there's no reason they couldn't be listening to it in 73. But another song in the film, Stumbling In, came out in 1978.
I know.
So is that a case of breaking the rules in favor of the song just really fitting the vibe?
We had to break the rules for that. We did try other songs, and Paul did really want to keep everything around 1973 or prior. But it just works so well. I really, that song is perfect. And we ended up breaking the rule for that.
Sometimes you got to break the rules to make the vibe work.
But the idea was always to be needle drops, except for the beginning and the end with Johnny's score. That was always the idea throughout. And then when the truck scene, the idea was always to play that dry.
Well, Johnny Greenwood is having quite a year. He composed the music not only for Licorice Pizza, but also Power of the Dog. And he's an artist that Paul has worked with quite often. Because they are such frequent collaborators, how might the process between composer, director, and editor on this film be different from other projects you've done? Is it more expeditious because you all know each other so well?
Usually Johnny is sending score while we're shooting, just ideas that he has, talking with Paul. Sometimes we'll send him dailies. So he's in previous movies, that's what he's doing, but not for this. For this, we had a solid cut that we sent him, and we had a piece of temp score in the spots, then kind of asked him to write something. So that's kind of what it was like for this one, more traditional.
Well, the opposite of using music to establish a period might be using visual effects to hide it. Plenty of credit should be going towards the production designer and props department and wardrobe and makeup. But there still has to be some kind of VFX work done to turn back the clock on the San Fernando Valley 50 years. I'd like to know more about any kind of VFX work you had to do for Licorice Pizza to sort of help the San Fernando Valley of today look like it's 1973.
Very little visual effects. Paul doesn't like to do it. Flo did an amazing job. She's a production designer. We did have to do some stuff, of course. The big wide shot when the truck is pulling onto Ventura Boulevard at the end, or end of the truck sequence, you could see Equinox, you could see all this stuff. Lights, street lights were in spots that there wouldn't be. That was too much. So we had to do that as a visual effect. There are a few reflections we had to remove, but really not a lot. I mean, maybe, well, one thing that we do is for the film version, for the 35 millimeter version, we'll only do some visual effects for that, because obviously that means you have to film it out, make a new negative. And the film out always looks a little different from original negative. So We did do a few speed ups. We had like one stabilization, and we had a dupe shot, which means you can't use the negative twice. So we had to film that out. Maybe like 35 or 40 shots, visual effects. The digital has a little bit more, but I mean, we don't do split screens. I was listening to the interview with Cam where he's talking about like they're sometimes putting different heads on people or whatever. I mean, we do not do that. No offense to the tricks, because, I've done it on other movies, but that's just, Paul doesn't want to do that. We always try to just stay with the original negative as much as possible.
Is that really challenging for you as an editor because you don't have those digital tricks at your disposal anymore? You're sort of constrained by the rules of film stock?
Sometimes, but it's also kind of freeing too, because it's like, this is the footage and you just got to make it work. Maybe there's going to be a little camera bump and Paul's okay with it. And that's just the way it is. It's just, that's how they used to do it in the old days. We also have to do titles too, all the titles and the whole end sequence. Obviously that was digital. We're not that crazy to do all that optically. But we do all our dissolves are AB dissolves that we do in the lab. So that is done photochemically.
So if you keep an eye on the credits, as long as we're talking about the film stuff, you'll see that there's a first assistant editor, Jay Troutman. Then there's first assistant film editor, William Fletcher. And then there's also an Avid rental credit and also film editing rental credit. So just from the personnel and workflow part of it, I mean, we've talked a lot about the things that you had to do or couldn't do in working with film. What was the process for actually who handled what? And when it says film editing rental equipment, what's going on there?
Well, yeah. So Jay was the Avid assistant, which we had to be separate because of COVID. So he was at his house and I was working with Paul at another location. We usually, in previous movies, we all are in like the same location, including Bill, the film assistant, and Erica, but just couldn't for this movie, unfortunately. So what we do is, we have all the film from dailies that we've used to watch. There's a point in which Paul is like, okay, this cut's good. Let's conform work print. So basically it means that all this film that we printed for dailies is not wasted. Jay will spit out a cut list, and then using those key codes, Bill builds a work print of the cut. This allows Paul to kind of, and me too, just to see the movie fresh, not digital, big, remembering what it looks like photochemically. And, it's a little rough because there's tape marks, and every time it goes through the projector, it kind of bumps a little bit. So you feel there's a cut there, you kind of are aware of where the cuts are. So it kind of, I don't know, gives you something. But it takes time. I mean, it takes at least, I think, a week and a half to build each reel. And then we'll use that. We'll screen, we screened for Leslie and Dylan. They came over and we watched the work print and talked about the movie. And, it's kind of a special thing. It's this kind of interim version of the movie that is our cut, but it's on film, but it's not fully timed. And it starts getting scratches and stuff like that. Bill is using Christie's Editorial. It's the company that we use to rent film equipment. And so they have a bench that he'll rent, and then there's a flatbed machine that we use to check sync. You use these discs called DV40s, and you make a wave file, basically burn it to the CD, and then through a DV40 machine, you sync up the work print with the audio. And so it's kind of double system. Instead of using mag tape, which they used to back in the day, you can use these DV40s. But ultimately, what we'll do is once we're finished and locked, we will take this work print and we'll give it to the negative cutter, Mo Henry. And then they've been doing their prep in the background, and then they will cut the movie based on the work print. So we know we have lists, but we also have like a physical work print that they can use to match as like a, confirmation.
Throughout your career, you've worked with a couple of editors, both of whom I think of very highly. One we've mentioned a few times, Dylan Tichenor, and the other one being Alan Baumgarten. You were post coordinator, I believe, on Charlie Bartlett with Alan, and you also assisted him on Trumbo.
Yep.
And I think we already talked about how you associate edited with Dylan on Phantom Thread. So for each of those guys, and I know I'm springing this on you, but was there anything in particular you took from either of them being an editor now yourself?
Yeah, I mean, Alan Alan and John Pohl and Kate, they're the three that I worked with on that first movie. I mean, which was a long time ago, and we're still really good friends, and they've championed me. It's really amazing. Alan, a big part of being an editor is just keeping the train moving, through all the ups and the downs and all sorts of crazy things that are thrown at you. And one thing that I really admire about him is that he's really able to be calm and collected and be very logical about how you're taking in notes and reacting. And it really has taught me a lot about keeping the train moving. And I don't know, there's a lot of politics involved in editorial, the room, you're spending a lot of time with people and there's deadlines and all sorts of stuff. But he's so good at sifting through all the different notes and kind of being the voice of reason. And Dylan is so logical and so smart, and the way that he's able to argue for certain things. I mean, Paul obviously has a very, strong point of view, and you're always trying to serve that point of view because his movies are so unique. But sometimes you do need to say, you know what, this just doesn't work. And sometimes that is hard to say, but Dylan is not afraid to say it, and we can have a dialogue about it. So it's good.
Dylan is very smart. It's very annoying. Some of the work that you've done with Paul, as you said, were music videos. What did you learn from doing those? And was there anything from that experience that you could apply to this film?
I think it helped build Paul and my relationship and our working relationship, and kind of the shorthand that we now have developed. A big part of working with the director is figuring out their sensibilities and what they like and what they don't like, and kind of getting ahead of that. And so working on all these music videos, which we actually made pretty quickly, we kind of figured out this shorthand. We also do the same thing. We watch dailies, not on film, but we would sometimes watch just when we were at the lab. So it's kind of with these little mini movies that we had to go through the whole process of dailies and cutting it and then finishing it and sending it out. So it's just on a really small scale, but I think doing that over and over and over again. And then when we did Anima, which was like a 15-minute one, much more involved, that was kind of the biggest thing that I had done with him as just a main editor on. So yeah, I mean, it just helped build our relationship.
Already talked about how Paul really places a lot of importance on the communal aspects of watching dailies together. What about when the film is done? COVID or not, does he do test screenings?
No, we did not do test screenings for this movie. We did have screenings for friends and family, but it was all very small scale because of COVID. And we have a place, where we work, where we have the film projector, but we also have digital projectors, and the Avid's in the room too. So we can play cuts in this room and show the movie. So he has, some filmmaker friends that come and see it, and family and other trusted people. We did show the studio. So we did have a screening at MGM, but I've said this before. I think the most people we ever had in a single screening to watch this movie was maybe 15 or 20 people, until our first screening in November for like 600 people. So, and it's, I know from experience, because I worked on a bunch of J. Roach movies where he tests, 15, 20 times. It can be very, very, very valuable for a comedy to test. But the COVID aspect, but also Paul really doesn't want information to be leaked out, and that will happen. It's better to kind of be insular. It could have probably benefited from maybe a test screening, but overall, I'm really happy with how the jokes played in the big theater. So I think it worked.
Me too. There are some great cameos in the film, some obvious, some not so obvious. In the obvious department, you already brought up the terrific scene between Tom Waits and Sean Penn. Penn's playing this aging, I think he's an action hero. And, in true Paul Thomas Anderson fashion, somehow this scene culminates with Penn doing a motorcycle jump over a bonfire on a golf course.
Yeah.
It didn't look like it to me, but Maybe there's a reason our mutual acquaintance asked me to ask you this, but he asked, did Sean Penn do all his own writing?
He didn't do that jump. That it was a stunt guy. Sorry to say. But everything else, I mean, with him, there's no like head replacements or anything.
No, not this time. Well, in the not so obvious casting department, our mutual friend also asked, does anyone ever recognize John C. Reilly in his uncredited cameo as Herman Munster?
Yes, actually, in the screenings that we've had, people have recognized him. Usually there's a quarter of the people that are laughing. And so you're like, okay, those people got it.
Andy, you've been such a good sport. Final question. Knowing that editors often find a way into the film, especially in more intimate films like this, what early 70s icon could you have played in this movie?
I don't know. Well, I have a little, I don't have a cameo, but there is a reference to me in the movie. So maybe this counts. On the side of Fat Bernie's, there's signage for Jurgensen markets, spelled the same way. And actually, what is period accurate, and there was a Jurgensen grocery store in the 70s. I think it went out of business in the 80s or 90s, but it was like a fancy gourmet store. No relation to my family, but it's spelled the exact same way with the S-E-N, and they ended up using that. And I didn't even know until I saw the dailies. I was like, oh my God, that's me.
That is you, Andy. And not just a sign on the wall, but in the credits of the movie. Congrats to Andy on his first gig as lead editor on a feature film. And big thanks to Andy for talking with us today about his experience both during and prior to Licorice Pizza. I didn't realize how much I had forgotten about the film editing process. And another thanks to Paul Thomas Anderson for keeping it alive. The world is a better place with a little mechanical editing still going on. All right, we have come to the logical and inevitable end to our episode. Thanks for hanging out with me and meeting Andy. I do hope you learned a lot, and not just about film editing. You see, there's always something new to learn about, even if it's something old you're learning about. What will we learn next week? Well, we'll see. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.